changes in our policy toward Cuba during the pendency of this administration.
All right, I'm happy you're saying that. Laudable to hear that, but specifically, is it under review right now? Because if you're going to remove a country from a list of terrorists, of this country's sponsors of terrorism, you need to start a review. And my question is it yes or no? Is Cuba under review?
Under the law, depending on the different authorities of this kind, some mandate a regular review, others don't. All I can tell you right now, sitting here today, is I don't anticipate any changes in our policy.
So you are telling me that between now and January 20th, the President of the United States is not planning to remove those bastards, the Cuban regime, off the list of countries that sponsor terrorism?
As I said, I don't anticipate any changes.
You don't anticipate. Right. So how can I interpret anticipate? Can you commit right now that that's not going to happen? You know why? Because all I'm doing is trying to prevent, to give money to the repressive apparatus that has been taking everything away from the Cubans. You're aware of that, right? So I just need to make sure that you understand the message from my community. Do not do that. Don't give them the oxygen that they want to continue greasing the repressive apparatus. Tell me.
And
you have 20
again,
seconds.
I can't. I do not make decisions for the
Sure
president.
you do. Come on. Sure you do. You're the State Department. You give the recommendation whether to take them or not. Tell me. I'm sorry.
All I can tell you is I don't anticipate any changes in our policy toward Cuba between now and the end of this administration.
Thank you. I'm going to take your word as your bond. Let's keep it that way. I appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, I'd like to focus my questions on a topic of great importance to my home state of Arizona, the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I believe we're at a make or break moment for the region. Our two countries face significant shared challenges, and there remains a lot of work to do to address migration, securing our borders against illicit drugs trafficked north and arms trafficked south, and to fight pervasive organized crime. But the U.S.-Mexico relationship is more than just migration and security. Our economies are fundamentally intertwined. Mexico recently surpassed China to become U.S. largest trading partner, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in my home state of Arizona. And I am particularly excited about the vast economic potential of nearshoring, moving supply chains closer to the United States market as hundreds of businesses, including semiconductor supply chain enterprises critical to our national security, move from Asia back to America or to North America or even Latin America. Meanwhile, the upcoming World Cup gives us an opportunity to forge a durable security relationship to address international threats. There's a choice in front of us now. Do we choose to forge a strategic path forward together, rooted in mutual respect and cooperation, or do we each go it alone? The Mexican government recently passed a series of sweeping constitutional reforms that will harm the U.S.-Mexico relationship, overhauling its independent judiciary, eliminating independent regulatory agencies, and closing access to its energy markets. These changes could undermine Mexico's obligation under the USMCA, and I have heard from business leaders in Arizona and around the country who are anxious that these reforms will hurt investor confidence and their ability to do business in Mexico. Secretary Blinken, how do you see these constitutional changes impacting our economic relationship with Mexico?
Well, first, you're exactly right about the importance of that economic relationship. It's vital to this country, it's vital to Mexico, and our citizens benefit from it every single day. Second, the Mexicans, of course, have the sovereign right to make their own laws, amend their own constitution. That's not for us to say. As their friend and partner, and as countries that are bound together by the USMCA, though we do have opinions on some of the steps that they're taking, and we have raised concerns about certain aspects of the constitutional reform, the judicial reform in particular, and we've shared those very clearly and very directly with the Mexican government, both with former President López Obrador and with President Sheinbaum. But the Mexicans will make their own decisions about this. But the concerns that we've underscored are exactly what you just cited, which is what effect does this actually have on private sector and investment that's so critical to actually meeting the full potential of this relationship, including things like nearshoring, including having a supply chain where Mexico and the United States are joined in the most critical things necessary to our economies and even to our security.
And I want to commend Ambassador Ken Salazar for speaking with such clarity on this most important issue. There were a recent discussion about sweeping 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and Canada by the President-elect, Secretary Blinken. In your opinion, how would these proposed tariffs impact U.S. and diplomatic interests in Mexico?
Look, I don't want to speculate on what the incoming administration will do or not do. That's really not my place. I think what I can say is just to underscore what you said a few minutes ago, which is this economic partnership is so vital, and we want to maximize it, not minimize it. Mexico's now the U.S., it's our top trade partner for goods. We've got $800 billion traded in the last year we have accounting for, 2023. That's more than $1 million every single minute of every single day. So I think we just want to make sure, whatever we do and whatever the incoming administration does, how do we strengthen that? How do we build on that? Because it's good for both of our countries.
I mentioned the upcoming World Cup as a unique opportunity, North American World Cup, for U.S., Mexico, Canada to work together to build obviously an incredibly important security partnership to make sure the World Cup is as safe as possible, but then make that a durable security partnership and relationship. How should the United States government work with the Sheinbaum administration on a security partnership to counter the drug cartel's violent crime?
Well, we've been working incredibly closely together over the last almost 4 years now on exactly that, and I think that work's continuing with the new Sheinbaum administration. You saw one of the results just the other day. The Mexicans seized, with our help, 20 million fentanyl pills. Each one could have killed an American citizen. They've seized more fentanyl at the border over the last 2 years than in the previous 5 combined.
Gentleman's time has expired.
This is a
Chair recognizes Ms. Kim.
the work that we're doing together. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Good luck.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member, for holding today's hearing. The American people and the families of our 13 fallen service members and the Afghan allies are demanding answers. Secretary Blinken, your appearance before our committee today is long overdue as we seek to understand the role that you played in the Biden-Harris administration's failed and disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal in August 2021. And in your previous conversation with my colleagues before me, you claimed that you have done everything you can to support Afghan women and girls, yet you excluded them and Afghan civil society from Taliban talks with the UN in Doha. So why do you continue to deprioritize Afghan women and girls? Sorry.
Just the contrary. We've done everything we can to integrate them, their voices, their views, into everything we do, including any engagements that we've had with the Taliban, including in the engagements that we have with partners around the world, particularly when it comes to decisions being made about recognizing or otherwise engaging with the Taliban. So it's exactly the opposite. We've made every effort to engage women and girls.
We're continuing to hear from those families, and also this committee has heard gravely concerning stories of what it was like trying to get through HKIA as an evacuee. Your own personnel testified that there was little to no guidance from you on who qualified to be evacuated from Afghanistan. So based on documents we received and witnesses we interviewed, at no point did you identify who the U.S. would be responsible for getting out during the non-combat evacuation operations. So did you ever determine which populations were eligible to be evacuated?
Yes, absolutely, and that was very clear. There were
Who were they then?
Very discrete populations: American citizens, legal permanent residents, and Afghan allies and partners, particularly those who had stood with us.
How did your department determine which populations were eligible for evacuation? Who was responsible for making those decisions?
These are determinations that are made by the administration, by the State Department, and when it comes to Afghans at risk, there were many Afghans at risk that we were seeking to get out, and because this was such a dynamic situation with conditions changing by the hour, at different moments during the evacuation, we had greater access to certain parts of that population than others. So we focused where we could.
What documents did those evacuees have to provide to prove their eligibility? Are you aware of a hall pass that your department provided instead of legal identification documentation?
We sought to do everything possible to get them the documents or identification that they needed in order, as necessary, to get through the Taliban, which had control of the area around the airport, and of course, documentation is necessary for our own people.
That hall pass that we're talking about were reprinted in droves. That was then sold to people outside of HKIA. So did you direct them to replace legal identification documents with a forgeable Word document?
No, we provided, as best we could, legal and
Then
enforceable
who did?
documents.
Because apparently they were shared.
I have not seen that, but I'm happy to look at whatever information you have about that.
Okay, you know, during the evacuation, over 80 Afghans who risked their lives to work with the United States government contacted my office for assistance. So when you include their families, that's more than 526 Afghans who claim they faced a direct or personalized threat. But despite the referral to SIV program, my office is only aware of only like 80 applicants who are able to complete the requirements and file. And of those 3, none have been approved and are still awaiting processing. Hearing from those Afghans, the SIV verification process has been difficult and tedious. And according to your deputy, one of the biggest obstacles to the verification process came from SIV applicants who have been employed by the DoD contractors, and that was well documented. Yet, you did not ask the DoD for support until the end of July 2021. So why'd you wait until just weeks before the Afghanistan withdrawal to fix that obvious issue?
No. These were long-standing issues and problems with the SIV program going back many years, and as I said earlier, we inherited a program that was totally moribund. There hadn't been a single interview for an SIV going back to March of 2020 when we came to office. We immediately reinstituted the interviews. I immediately surged resources to go through the SIV applications. We cut the time in half to process the applications. We went from issuing 100 visas a week on SIVs to 1,000 a week. All of that happened in the space of just 5 or 6 months because of our dedication to the program. But we inherited a program not only moribund, but that had 14 different steps required by Congress to make sure that the SIV was issued in the appropriate way. And of course, security, usually important. We want to make sure that we're not bringing threats into the country. That's important. Being able to document effectively, yes, that they had been working with us. And the challenge, as you rightly point out, was that because it was with DoD, it was contractors, many of whom were out of business.
I agree this is a very important issue
We can
that we'd
follow
like
up
to
on that.
follow up with you, Mr. Secretary. Chair recognizes Ms. Madeline Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to echo the words of many others on both sides of the aisle. I feel lucky to have had the chance to serve with you on this committee as you were our chairman. You are our chairman. Look forward to the renaming of this room. I thank Mr. Meeks as well. It's been a pleasure. I do acknowledge the attendance of Gold Star families and other military families and veterans. Thank you for your extraordinary sacrifice and service. And thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here, for being in front of us and being available to tell us sometimes harsh truths, and also to just reveal the thoughtfulness that your department has taken over the course of these years. So I thank you for that. And it is important to understand what happened with the withdrawal of Afghanistan. It's important to understand what happened before, after, during, after. And my only problem with this report and this set of hearings and the set of questions that you are facing is that sadly this became a partisan investigation and never should have. This committee sadly came up with a report digging into evidence that would only focus on the Biden administration, a 20-year war, a withdrawal set in place by the previous administration. The cherry picking was clear. The report's own methodology says, quote, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is understood to encompass the U.S. military retrograde beginning with the go-to-zero order officially announced by President Biden on April 14th, 2021. That's a strange, very narrow window if we really want to understand what happened, what went wrong, what went right. So Secretary Blinken, just to set the record straight, The Doha Agreement was entered into under the Trump administration, is that correct?
That is correct.
Signed on February 29th, 2020. The agreement included a commitment to reduce U.S. forces in Afghanistan to 8,600 troops in 135 days. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
The only other force reduction commitment in the agreement was complete withdrawal of U.S. forces within 14 months. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Then President Trump, despite not being required by the agreement, ordered more troop drawdowns, as he was eligible to do as President of the United States, those being in September of 2020, reduction to 4,500 troops. Am I right?
That's correct.
And then, strangely to me, in January of 2021, on the administration's way out the door, a reduction to 2,500 troops. Is that correct?
It is.
Puzzling, absolutely puzzling. So those were all actions taken before Mr. Biden was even sworn into office, January of 21. What effect did the significant reductions have on the administration and on the withdrawal?
Well, I think the combination of the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners under the agreement and the reduction in U.S. forces to 2,500 put the Taliban in the strongest position it had been in since 9/11, and the United States in arguably the weakest position we've been in because we had the fewest number of forces on the ground than we'd had since 2001.
What a terrible, deadly combination of factors. And also, again, so much good was able to be done under those horrifying circumstances, but nothing can take away the tragedy of Abbey Gate. I'd like to move, just as Ms. Manning did, to other issues of the day, very critical issues of the day. Ukraine. I have always believed that the United States must do everything in our power to be sure that Ukraine has everything it needs to win. What is going on in these last few weeks of the administration, lifting of any more restrictions, imposing any more sanctions on Russia or Russian banks, what is the administration able to do?
We're determined in the time that we have left to make sure that, to the best of our ability, Ukraine has everything it needs to be as successful as possible and continue to push back on the Russian aggression, to make sure that it has what it needs if it chooses, by necessity, to fight through 2025, or if there's to be a negotiation, that it can negotiate from a position of strength. And so that means making sure that it has the weapons, the munitions, et cetera, that it has the resources, the money, and also that it has mobilized forces to deal with the aggression.
I appreciate all that. My time is limited. Israel, Gaza, where are we on a ceasefire? It has been 431 days since the horrific Hamas attack, 431 days, hostages still held. Where are we? When will we get them home?
We want to get them home now.
Yes.
As we speak, there are intense efforts underway to see if we can reach, finally, a hostage ceasefire deal. Again, it's ongoing. That's as much as I can say right now.
And I hope that humanitarian aid is
Yes.
flowing more fully. I appreciate your letter. Please see our letter to you.
Yes.
Again, thank you for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you.
No, he yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to review a couple dates. First, on February 29, 2020, the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. The agreement promised a conditions-based incremental withdrawal, and the Trump administration delayed that withdrawal precisely because those conditions were not being met. On April 11, 2021, the go-to-zero presence in Afghanistan was given by the Biden administration, and that was given freely by the administration, despite not being in compliance with the Doha Agreement. Your own Deputy Assistant Secretary Mark Evans testified before this committee that the decision to go to zero was not contingent upon the Doha Agreement. Secretary, one of the dates I really want to focus on is July 8th, 2024. That's the date that the total withdrawal was finalized by the administration, and the date certain. It's shifted from a conditions-based to a date certain. Is that correct?
The date certain was there, I believe, starting in April, when the president said we would follow through on the withdrawal that the previous administration had agreed to, except it was extended from May 31st to September.
So it was always going to be date certain, not conditions-based.
Well, that was what the
So
Doha
that's what
agreement.
look. That's what you said. So when you made that decision, did the State Department block American citizens from departing from the airfield in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan?
Absolutely not.
They didn't?
blocked
Who
American
did then?
citizens.
Who blocked them?
I'm not aware of blocking any U.S. citizens. On the contrary, we were doing
You
everything
know
possible
they were
to get
blocked. You
citizens out.
know they were blocked.
I'd be happy to look at any information you have on that. I'm not aware of any American citizens who were blocked. And in fact, we were doing everything possible. And by the way, I want to thank you and thank every member who's been involved in this and the work that they did to get
Mr.
Americans
Secretary, your State Department blocked American citizens and Afghan allies from leaving there. I personally worked with your State Department during those days. I have the emails, I have the photographs of American blue passport holding American citizens who were on the airfield awaiting departure that got clearance for safe third countries to depart to, and the order came down from the United States government. Was it the State Department?
I'm not aware of any such orders. I'm happy to follow up and look at that. I'm certainly not aware of it. We were doing everything possible.
Last
to
year,
get
Colonel
Americans out.
Francis Hong, my classmate, testified before this committee that due to the fiasco in Kabul, many Americans and allies were forced to conduct a dangerous 400-mile journey to Mazar-e-Sharif Air Base where they were delayed for weeks. Colonel Hong testified, quote, that we spent 3 weeks hiding these nearly 400 people from the Taliban, keeping them alive and fed using funds from American donors. All this while the State Department delayed and frankly blocked American citizens from leaving. Secretary Blinken, I have communications, as I said, that show this happened. And you're saying that didn't happen?
Why would we block Americans from
That's the
leaving
problem I
Afghanistan?
have. I had
Why?
it at the time.
were-
Why?
Possible to get
And
them out,
here's
but
the
I'm
thing,
happy-
Mr.
happy to look at
Secretary.
the information.
As I was working with your State Department while you were Secretary of State and relaying this information, someone said to me, which tail number? Which tail number? You mean there's more than one plane you guys are blocking? Are you freaking kidding me? And then your State Department wanted to deny it, and here today you won't even acknowledge the truth of that. It's disgusting. To try to blame this on Donald Trump when we all know there is no way that anyone forced you guys to do the dumbest thing possible. You don't have to have worn our nation's uniform like I and other people did to know that first you get the civilians out, then the military, not the other way around. This has to be one of the dumbest, most poorly executed paths to depart any country possible. My only hope is that in the 11 embassy evacuations that have happened on your watch, an unprecedented number, you've somehow gotten better at it. It's appalling to see you sit here and say, oh, I express sympathy, and yet have never acknowledged the failures or own the consequences of it. In fact, to this date, the only person that's been fired was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps who spoke out. None of you have been held accountable. None of you even expressed shame or embarrassment. Have you learned anything? Have you learned anything from this?
First of all, on the planes, just to come back to it, the Taliban was blocking planes. We worked to clear them. And I'm happy to go over that with you, with your office, and also to see any information you have to make sure that we get to the bottom of what you're saying. But we were certainly not in the business of blocking Americans. We were in the business of getting them out.
Well, I appreciate
and
you
continuing
did
to do
create a
that.
position after that to address the problem. So you clearly had to be aware of it. You created a position to facilitate the coordination after you left them behind.
Of course, we were determined to get every American who wanted to get out, and that didn't
Gentleman,
stop on August 31st.
gentleman yields.
We got 500 Americans out
Chair
between then and the end of the year
recognizes
because
Mr.
of that
Crow.
ongoing commitment.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, of coming before the committee voluntarily and providing your perspective and helping address the questions of the committee. As you know, I served multiple combat tours in Afghanistan, and like the tens of thousands of Americans that did, we left pieces of our heart behind in that country. And even though the military chapter and the diplomatic chapter are largely closed, although there are still issues that are in America's interest, those of us who served in combat roles with the Afghans feel a special obligation to make sure that we are protecting those friends and those folks who, in many cases, saved our lives. I mean, there's a lot of Americans, and I know you know this well, Secretary. We've had these conversations, and I know this is a sentiment that you share very deeply as well. I mean, these are people who, at great personal risk to them and their families, took on jobs that helped bring Americans home. And the story of that is not a finished story. So with that in mind, I would love to hear from you. Can you speak to the number of currently eligible SIV Afghans who are in that country? How many do we think are still there? And what are we doing to help get them out? What does the pipeline look like, and what more do we need to do?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your enduring commitment to this. So we have right now about 63,000 SIV applicants who are in the so-called pre-chief of mission phase. That is, they've expressed interest, they've started to compile the necessary documentation. We believe, based on experience, that roughly 20% will become fully documented. That's 20% of 63,000. There are 54,000 who are actually at the chief of mission phase right now. Again, based on our analysis, we believe roughly 35% of those will likely be approved because, as you know, unfortunately, many people wash out either because they simply don't qualify or because of documentation issues, which we've tried to remedy over the last couple of years. Finally, we have right now 10,000 who have chief of mission approval. The only thing they're waiting for is their interview, which they need to do out of country. Of those 10,000, about 9,000 are in Afghanistan. We have 6 flights a week now that are going out of Afghanistan to different places. And so we're working expeditiously to move people out, finish the process with an interview, and then get them on to the United States. That's roughly the current population.
And I know these averages change, but can you give me a snapshot of a typical month? How many folks are we getting out of Afghanistan?
We're working to get roughly 1,000 a week.
Okay. And at the current rate, I worked with House leadership to get 12,000 additional visas authorized earlier this year. At the current burn rate, when do we run out of authorization? And I obviously will make a pitch to my colleagues here to join our effort to push for 20,000 additional visas in the next appropriation, which we're advocating.
We need that. We will run out of of the allotment we have. That's the basis for our support for getting another 20,000.
When do you think we're going to run out?
Let me come back to you with the exact time based on our most recent analysis.
Okay. The last piece is the State Department did a pretty extensive and thorough after-action review. There was a classified version of that, a public version of that. I've spent a lot of time reviewing both documents, and as a result of that, I have introduced legislation, the Crisis Act, to help codify some of the changes. Can you just tell us very briefly, what are some of the reforms and changes you made within the department to, ensure that the problems and the shortfalls that we experienced in the withdrawal, we're learning from those lessons, and we're ensuring that we're fixing things going forward?
Yeah, and very briefly, and much of this is in the report, including the unclassified version. We now have a common operating picture that we didn't have before, where we're fusing all of the information that we need in a crisis, whether it's cables, whether it's open source, whether it's intelligence. We now have what we didn't have before, which is a modern operations center, so that we can surge resources, stand up a task force immediately, bring in the other agencies to do that. We now have what we didn't have before, which is a streamlined cloud-based system to track all of our engagements with American citizens, to make sure we're not duplicating, to make sure that we're in near real-time communication with them. We're working to better utilize our own personnel. We've stood up a 100-person roster of Rapid Response Corps. People sign up for 6 months. That means that they're ready on a moment's notice to become part of a task force. They get training throughout that period on what they'll need to know if there's an emergency. We've stood that up. I see my time is up. I'm happy to go over.
I'm just trying to make sure you stay on schedule for your
Thank you,
flight.
Mr. Chairman.
Your flight to the Middle East. I don't want you to miss that.
I appreciate that, Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Green is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on investigating this. I'm over here, Secretary.
Thank you.
This catastrophic withdrawal, and I want to thank you, Secretary Blinken, for attending today. I'm going to preface my comments with something very similar to what the chairman prefaced his comments with. We've worked well together on nearshoring and stuff like that, getting the Tennessean out of Venezuela.
Yeah.
Roger Carson's my classmate, did a fantastic job with that. But today, my comments are going to be, as a global war on terror veteran who served in Afghanistan, I want to once again recognize the sacrifice of all the Americans that fought for our country in Afghanistan. I lost friends there. But those of you who came home, your service was not in vain. Those of you who died there, your service was not in vain. You helped keep our country safe for 2 decades. And I am grateful for your sacrifice and the sacrifices of your families. As a Night Stalker flight surgeon and an Army Ranger infantry officer, I remember our most sacred creed, leave no man behind. Secretary Blinken, you and our Commander-in-Chief left people behind. You left those in your care behind. You left Americans and our allies behind. Your delayed appearance before this committee, I think, is a disgrace to those Americans who did die in Afghanistan, and your decisions or the absence of leadership on this issue during the withdrawal of 2021 are directly responsible for the disaster. Prior to President Biden's go-to-zero approach, the Taliban had ignored U.S. attempts for a smooth exit and shown themselves totally ignoble negotiators. We knew the dangers, and yet, as the military withdrew, you told U.S. Embassy Kabul to remain. Furthermore, you actually increased personnel. When senior security advisors and leaders at DOD and embassy staff said it was time to make a non-combatant evacuation operation plan, an EO plan, you said no. Instead, when the day came for the embassy to evacuate, there was no plan. You left your personnel high and dry to figure it out on their own. In fact, you never even issued the NEO. As Secretary of State, that is your responsibility, but instead the NSC had to make that call. Did you step in? No. The NSC continued to lead the initial response, including decision-making regarding Afghan population eligible for evacuation, which should have been states' responsibility. Because you weren't at the helm, there was little documentation or communication. State personnel had to rely on spur-of-the-moment decision-making just to get to the airport, and thousands of evacuees were left in limbo. Now, I also want to share a story, a conversation I had with the leader of one of our greatest allies, Britain. I had a conversation with Boris Johnson 6-8 months ago. I was at dinner with him, and I asked him, I said, hey, could you confirm a rumor, Mr. Prime Minister? Could you confirm the rumor that the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, Joe Biden, you called him and asked him to stay an extra 5 days, just 5 days, so that all the Brits could get out? And Boris Johnson told me, Chairman Green, I remember exactly where I was when I made the phone call. I asked for 5 more days, and President Biden told me no. This is our greatest ally on the planet, participating in the Red Sea with us against the Houthis when few others would. I pulled wounded British SAS guys off a target in Iraq. Their blood was on my hands. And I'm going to tell you, that relationship is, it's one of our greatest, if not our greatest. And yet we slapped them in the face and said, no, you don't get 5 extra days to get your people out. This according to the Prime Minister of England at the time. I find that unconscionable. And senior leaders at DOD have come here and testified. Senior leaders at DOD have testified on the HASC and told us, we were telling the State Department 4 or 5 months in this drawdown period, get your stuff together, and they didn't. Why?
Mr. Chairman, I hope you give me time to respond, because I dispute virtually everything that was said, with great respect, though, for the member and particularly for his extraordinary service to our country. First, did we leave people behind? No, we got them out, including after the deadline of our evacuation. By the time we got to August 31st, we had, as I said, several hundred Americans who were left, who had identified themselves to us as wanting to leave but could not get to or into the airport. I committed to make sure we got them out, and between the end of the evacuation and the end of the year, we got the 500 remaining Americans out who either then or after August 31st identified themselves as wanting to leave. We made good on that commitment. Telling the embassy to remain open. Yes, we all wanted the embassy to remain open. It was fully our expectation that the Afghan government and the Afghan military would not collapse. It was the desire of Congress to make sure that we remained engaged in Afghanistan, including to look out for our own citizens, including to make sure we were doing right by the SIVs. And it was fully our intention to continue to bring them out by keeping the embassy open. And as I've said earlier, and as many others have testified, no one anticipated the collapse of the forces. No one anticipated the collapse of the government. When it comes to the NEO, again, let me be very clear. The State Department initiated the NEO. We did. That's what the record reflects. But this is a collective decision. As an instrumental matter, the State Department initiates it by requesting it of DOD. The decision to initiate it was a decision taken by the NSC and ultimately by the President. Not once before we initiated the NEO did anyone say you need to do this among the principals in the administration. It was a collective decision on the 14th of August. Those capitals, provincial capitals, started to fall on the 6th, and by the 14th, we decided that the NEO was imperative. Now, there's a reason, Congressman, that it was so important that we focus on this. The Ghani government was pleading with us throughout the summer, don't engage in an evacuation. That will actually precipitate exactly what we're trying to prevent, which is a collapse of the government, a collapse of confidence, people fleeing the countries in uncontrolled ways. So that was also part of our thinking. But in terms of preparing, yes, we started preparing intensely going back to April. Multiple exercises with different agencies, tabletop and otherwise, planning through different scenarios. We had tripwires, we had indicators, all of which came into effect. We moved the embassy in 48 hours to the airport. That wouldn't have happened without a plan. We got control of the airport because we had pre-positioned forces. We were able to start moving people out in 72 hours. We moved 120,000 people out, the largest evacuation in the history of this country.
Mr. Secretary, I will tell you that your DOD colleagues don't remember it that way. And I remember your face when we got that secret briefing during the midst of this, during the height of it. We all gathered in HVC. And I'm going to tell you, I think our memory here isn't as accurate as it could be. And I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. I'll never forget the fear in your face and I don't have anything else to say.
Gentlemen, let me just add, I think this is a very important issue the gentleman raised from Tennessee, and I appreciate your perspective, Mr. Secretary. I'll tell you what our investigation revealed, that Ambassador Wilson did not want a NEO. In fact, he punished his staff for even mentioning the word NEO. And it wasn't, we got from the DOD, as you indicated, on August 6, 2021, that the NSC said, National Security Council said, a NEO equates to failure, quote unquote. That is what was going on. A NEO equates to failure. Maybe that's because President Ghani, as you said, Mr. Secretary, but those are really the facts. And only until August 15th, the day that Kabul fell, think about that, the day that Kabul falls is the first time that Ambassador Wilson requests a NEO, and by that time, sir, it was too late. With that, I recognize Ms. Kamlager-Dev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for gracing us with your presence again. I have actually some questions about the Sudan, but because we have continued to talk about NEO, I will also ask a question on this. So Ambassador Wilson testified to the committee during a transcribed interview about the specified reasoning for why he called the NEO on August 15th, describing the situation that included thousands of Tlaib fighters streaming directly into Kabul, a flow that contradicted orders that assurances that we had received from the Tlaibs, and orders that we believed had been given for them to stop by Taliban senior leadership, the expected seizure of 2 prisons later that day, and the release of thousands of inmates. Tlaib fighters, ISIS fighters, common criminals, and the abandonment oversight of checkpoints into and within Kabul's green zone that were vital to our security. We had been striving to maintain embassy operations in accord with the direction given to us. This was no longer possible. And at that point, I recommended to Secretary Blinken our immediate evacuation. He agreed, and the White House subsequently approved a non-combatant evacuation. The majority has repeatedly pointed to the testimony of military leaders to argue that the State Department waited too long to initiate the NEO. But Ambassador Wilson had a clear rationale for his timing, and that calling for the NEO too soon would have complicated our ability to get out. If we had left earlier, several thousand SIV applicants that we got out in whatever the number of days that you want to talk about would not have been able to leave the country. We would not have been able to provide support to American citizens trying to get out. Our eyes and ears about what was happening around us would have been drastically degraded. Secretary Blinken, would you agree that Ambassador Wilson's testimony reflects a detailed and realistic understanding of the conditions on the ground?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. What would have been the repercussions if the State Department had called a NEO before conditions on the ground warranted one?
Yeah, it would have actually precipitated those very conditions, and it would have made it more difficult for us to get people out, including American citizens. The airport was open until August the 15th. We were trying to avail ourselves and push people out to take commercial flights. It would have made it much more difficult to get SIV-eligible people out of the country, other Afghans at risk. All of that would have been made more difficult by precipitating the very kind of crisis we ultimately saw. And again, I come back to a fundamental proposition, which is that no one, and I say this collectively, this is the State Department, this is the intelligence community, it's the DOD, in terms of the consensus view on where this was going, there was no consensus view that the government, the Afghan forces, were going to collapse. Our military, having worked with them for 20 years, believed that they would stay and fight. They needed to have the sustained support to do that. General McKenzie has said that, including financial and logistics support. We had no indication that the government would fall. The intelligence community didn't see that. We have very remarkable people at the State Department, including those who wrote the so-called descent channel cable, who were very concerned about what would happen after we left in terms of the durability of the government. I read that cable immediately. I responded to it almost immediately, and many of the measures that they called for in the cable were already in train, because what they were focused on was trying to make sure that we got people out of the country, especially the SIVs. And as I've talked about earlier, that's exactly what we were doing, having taken a program that was dead in the water, revived it, and accelerated it dramatically.
Thank you also for just even mentioning the descent cable and the fact that regardless of if you agree with them or not, there is still a space for folks within the State Department to register discontent. I certainly hope that that is a practice that will continue in this next administration. I would now like to ask in the few moments that I have left about the war in the Sudan, which is a catastrophic humanitarian crisis impacting innocent civilians. I think it is a moral outrage. Over 150,000 have been killed, 11 million have been displaced. The evidence of genocide in Darfur is significant, and I believe an official genocide determination against the RSF and allied militia is long overdue. Why has the administration refrained from making a genocide determination, and do you intend to come to a decision about a determination before the end of this year?
First, and very quickly, you're right to put a spotlight on Sudan. It's the worst humanitarian situation in the world by far, by orders of magnitude. We're working intensely to try, of course, to bring an end to it, but in the first instance, to get assistance to people who desperately need it. We've made some progress on that in the last few weeks with both the SAF and to a lesser extent with the RSF. But in terms of atrocities, war crimes, genocide, we've been making determinations already about atrocities and war crimes. We're looking at the question of genocide, whether we complete that review in the time that we have. I can't.
Trying to be respectful. Generally, time has expired. Let me just, if I could comment, I mean, you did not see it coming. I've heard that over and over. Perhaps we were getting different intelligence briefings, but I certainly saw it coming, and your own employees in the embassy saw it coming when they sent the descent cable to you, a cry for help that Kabul's falling and the embassy will fall soon. And I don't know how you can say that, honestly, sir, with a straight face. The chair recognizes Mr. Heisinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate your work as leading this committee. But Secretary Blinken, how many U.S. citizens are still in Afghanistan?
I can't give you an exact number because we never know for sure. There are several.
Do you believe they're all voluntary? I still think you're going to start to say there's several thousand.
No, I believe that any American citizens who are left, there are several, as you know, as is noted before, who have actually been detained. These are people who went there after the evacuation for one reason or another, have been detained by the Taliban. We're working every day to get them out.
Are you, hold on a second. Are you saying that the only people detained are those who went after the evacuation?
I'm saying the ones that we know of who are detained and that we're actively working.
We can clue you in. I got to give you credit. You are successful in doing this. You have completely pulled me off of what I was going to ask you about, much to my staff and everybody else's chagrin. But the crap that you are throwing out here about this is unbelievable. I will tell you, I was in that same briefing when you said that you thought there was, quote, several hundred citizens who were staying in Afghanistan voluntarily. My caseworker had 185 individuals alone in my district, the 4th District of Michigan, that were asking us for help to get out, including those who did make it to Hkaya and were beaten by the Taliban and were known by the U.S. troops. And the troops that are being shown up here, including one of my constituents who I've referred to as Jose and Carlos and Juan and various things, because I haven't wanted to use his real name at his request, who was blown up and injured and knew every single one of those Marines and those Navy corpsmen up there on that screen right now. They have not gotten satisfactory answers. And I will tell you, Secretary Blinken, that we have citizens there who are not there voluntarily, and they want to get out, and this State Department has utterly failed them. Failed them.
Congressman, if there are citizens that you have identified that have been in communication with you and that want to get out, please, if you haven't already, share that information with us.
We've shared it. We'll share it again, and we'll keep asking. And
we're happy to sit down and go through each of those cases.
At some point, the exercise in futility gets a little frustrating as a member, Secretary Blinken, when it does not feel like you're answering Mr. Green's questions or Mr. Warren's questions, or you're going to have a couple of other military folks who were there, had friends there. Well, I had a friend who was in Doha, and he's telling me that there was no damn plan to have all of those planes divert to Doha. So they got caught flat-footed. There was no place for them to go. It was a bungled exit. So I have to hit on a couple of the things that I have here, and I'm going to try to truncate this. Recent report by Inspector General of Afghan Reconstruction, John Sepko, found since August of 2021, implementing partners of yours from the State Department have paid at least $10.9 million in U.S. taxpayer funds to the Taliban in form of taxes, fees, and duties. In fact, the SIGAR noted that while conducting its investigation, your State Department repeatedly refused to cooperate. They then requested that the State Department attest to that it had distributed a questionnaire to all the relevant implementing partners, that responses were not altered, and that no attempts were made to influence the implementers' responses. However, at the time the report was published, your department refused to sign the attestation. Mr. Secretary, did you instruct your employees to obstruct the SIGAR investigation of U.S. tax dollars going to the Taliban? And since then, has that changed?
To the contrary, we've done everything possible to cooperate with SIGAR. 13,000 staff hours dedicated to this.
Why would the Inspector General say? Is the Inspector General lying?
SIGAR, in its report of, I believe, in 2023, said that the department was cooperating with SIGAR.
I got to skip a whole bunch of stuff. I just will say, Mr. Chairman, I've got a bill, H.R. 9503, Protecting Taxpayer Dollars from Taliban Theft Act, which makes U.S. policy that tax dollars, U.S. taxpayer dollars, do not be paid to the Taliban in form of taxes, duties, and fees. I wish I had a few more moments. I've got a couple of seconds here. I have to hit on this. this is about Iran. Thanks to congressional notification, we know that on November 8th, just days following the Democrats' election loss, you signed off on a sanction waiver providing the Tehran access to $10 billion in funds of Iraqi electricity payments. Last dated December 2023, Congress is aware of 2 releases of funds for humanitarian purposes to Iran. Have there been any other additional transactions since that period? So you have been allowing them access to the dollars. We know that there was 2 that got testimony, had problems. They asked for the explanation to be in behind closed doors. There was nothing that was top secret about that. It was just that egg was on their face. Have there been any more withdrawals?
I assume you've asked the previous administration about the waivers that it issued.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Complete, yes, actually we did.
Yes.
Actually we did.
Well,
And the
we did
explanation of why this administration allowed Korean funds, the funds that were used, that were shipped to Korea, that were supposed to stay in Korea, why were they shipped to Oman? Why were they allowed to have given a Treasury
you're confusing
license
2 things.
and the State Department license?
Two different
Oh,
things.
now you're conflating what had been going
No,
on.
I'm saying that the waivers that we issued were the same waivers issued.
They were
by
not, absolutely 100% not. See, this is the thing. A group of us are actually on the Financial Services Committee. I'm one of them. You can't throw this crap out because we actually write the sanctions. We actually know what the law is. And when you and Treasury come in here and say, oh, don't worry your pretty little head about all these confusing sanctions things, guess what? We wrote the damn things. We understand. And here you are throwing these load of, I wish I could curse more, Mr. Chairman, but I won't. This is so unbelievable. I am so glad to see this administration and you leaving because you have failed the American people with this. With that, I'm
Time's
way over.
expired. And for the record, let me say that I personally, in the emergency wartime supplemental that dealt with Israel, that dealt with Indo-Pacific and Ukraine, put the sanctions that was waived or not enforced back into law. That would be on energy and on missiles and drones coming out of Iran, funding their terror operations, killing Israelis and killing Ukrainians. And sir, I have to say, I agree with my friend here that it's very disappointing that that has not been enforced.
And Mr. Chairman, last administration did not authorize any releases of those funds. This administration did. That's the problem.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, if the Secretary wants to address the previous thing at all, I would be interested in your
I'm
remarks.
happy to share with the congressman everything we've done. We can go over this. We don't have time to do it now. I'm happy to do that, happy to show you exactly what we've done, what we haven't done, happy to get any information that you have to the contrary and work through this. All right? Thank you.
All right, thank you. And let me thank the Chairman, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks, having had the privilege to, again, waive on this committee for this term. It's been an honor working with you, and I appreciate that. I want to thank the outgoing Biden-Harris administration and directly you, Secretary Blinken, for your tireless efforts navigating some of the most critical challenges in recent history. I looked up the definition of the Drake Passage, why it's so treacherous, and it's unimpeded currents, large waves, strong waters, frequent storms, rough and unpredictable seas. You have navigated, I think, exactly that, rough and unpredictable seas. And as has been said even by the chairman, our relationship with NATO, our relationships in many places around the world are stronger. I also, earlier there was talk about President Biden's legacy vis-a-vis Israel. And I think it is a defining element. Fact of the matter is, since the invasion by Hamas on October 7th last year, President Biden has stood with Israel longer than any president in United States history, ensuring Israel's security and strengthening its position in a very dangerous neighborhood. As you noted, he was the only president to visit Israel during a time of war, not just the first, but the only. He supported Israel in immeasurable ways, including sending aircraft carrier, thwarting not one, but two attacks from Iran. And today, as we sit here, there are still talks, as the chair of the Abraham Accords, there are talks of bringing peace to the region, putting on a better course. No one has worked harder than I in trying to make sure we get aid into and throughout Gaza. I hope we can find a path to continue to move it in a better direction. Turning to the topic at hand, the majority's partisan report recommended Congress pass legislation to require certain dissent channel messages be shared with the Secretary of Defense, the intelligence community, other relevant agencies, and the chairs and ranking members of the congressional committees. Salman Ahmed, the Director of Policy Planning, testified that you personally read every dissent cable that comes in and personally clear the response. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Director Ogman also testified about the reaction to the dissent cable. Quote, "What I can say is that I think that those who read it at the time, their immediate reaction was, there's a lot here I agree with. There are a lot of things they're raising that in here that, in fact, we are already working on doing. They've added some details that are very helpful, so I think it was more a question of like having information that the drafters didn't have in some cases, in other cases, getting information from the drafters that was helpful." End quote. Does that testimony comport with your own reaction, namely that the dissent channel cable pointed to issues that were already under discussion with the department?
It does, but I want to underscore how valuable it was, both in reinforcing some of the things we were doing, as well as pointing some things that we then subsequently pursued.
Yeah. And if the cable had been more widely shared, do you think it would have changed the outcome?
No.
Okay. So although you made a single dissent cable available to us on this committee as part of a truly extraordinary, I want to emphasize again, truly extraordinary accommodation to the committee's investigation, do you think an expectation that dissent channel messages would be shared widely outside the department? What impact do you think that would have on the willingness of department personnel to utilize the dissent channel in the
I'm very
first place?
concerned it would have a chilling effect, and it would cause people not to engage in the dissent channel, which is a deeply honored tradition of the department going back to the Vietnam War, one I take very seriously. I read every single dissent channel cable. I respond to every dissent channel cable. It informs my views, but people need to know that they can come forward without fear or without favor, and knowing that this will be shared beyond the Secretary and my immediate office is something that I fear would have a chilling effect.
Not only would it possibly chill or make it people more reluctant to share that, if you don't get that information, what are the implications to what you're trying to achieve?
The implications are we will not be as well informed as we need to be, and it will make our decisions less effective than they otherwise would be.
All right. Thank you. And you know, if I expand, this hearing addresses one of the most significant and complex issues in recent memory. And I do want to recognize the families, the Gold Star families that are here, and all the Gold Star families of great Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan and other conflicts defending our nation. The withdrawal was in no small part shaped by the 2020 Doha Agreement that, as we have discussed, was negotiated not by this administration, but the preceding administration and handed over. By the time you received it, the Biden administration received it, the Taliban had gained significant ground. Options were limited. The recommit to a conflict without clear goals or commit to a complete withdrawal. It was an extraordinary achievement. More than 124,000 people were airlifted in just 17 days.
In keeping in time with the other members, the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Mills is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your continued leadership throughout this entire time. It has been an honor to serve in this committee, so I want to continue to thank you for that. Secretary Blinken, are you familiar with USC 22, Section 4802?
Please tell me.
It's basically your obligation in order to try and protect and provide security and safety for American citizens. Mm-hmm. Now, in one of your statements, you said, we did not leave Americans behind. Well, see, unlike other members on this, I actually went overseas and was conducting rescues of Americans left behind in Afghanistan. I actually conducted the very first successful overland rescue of Americans that were left behind, which was Miriam and her 3 children. These are Amarillo, Texas, American-born natives, who was at the front gate waving their passport, trying to get inside, while we were on the phone, myself and Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, trying to get your State Department task force to let them inside. You're telling me you didn't leave them behind?
I'm telling you, Congressman, that we got every American out that we could, and when we got completed the evacuation, I said we're not leaving anyone behind. We're to keep doing this until we get every American who says they want to leave and identify themselves to us out. And as I
you also said, though,
500
that,
between
I'm reclaiming my time. You also told Congressman Davidson that the U.S. government was not blocking aircraft. Is that correct?
I have no knowledge of the U.S. government.
Yet my aircraft, who had 5 approved PPRs, which are prior permission required landings, to HKIA, to rescue 28 Americans was denied 5 times, saying that it was at the behest of the Department of Defense and the Department of State to prevent us from coming in to rescue Americans. That was what was told to us over the radio from the ATC towers. But yet, to your knowledge, no one was being blocked. Let me tell you, that is a farce and it's a complete lie. I will also tell you that in a NEO, State Department does not take ultimate control once it is declared. It's the Department of Defense who actually is supposed to, yet your task force still try to hold operational control, which led to a lot of disruption, and that has been reported multiple times by commanders on the ground.
Yeah,
so I will tell you, I'm going to finish, sir. The other thing is that in Israel, a horrible incident occurred where over 1,200 people lost their lives. And yet the State Department had done nothing to come in and actually rescue Americans who had been left behind. How do I know that? Because the very first rescues conducted was on October 11th from Nazareth, Tiberias, and Haifa. How do I know it? Because I was the one who conducted them. 32 Americans that day, then into the West Bank, then into Jerusalem, then out towards Gaza. I got 255 Americans out by myself before the State Department lifted a finger and did anything to bring a plane in. Meanwhile, other nations were already flying aircraft in and out, rescuing their citizens. Again, another failure of 22 USC 4802.
Not correct.
I will also, it is correct, and the reason I know it's because I was there. Were you there, sir?
I had an
Were you there,
entire
sir?
embassy there.
You were not. Let's
I
go
had
ahead and
an
start
entire
with that.
embassy there, and I've been there 12 times.
Yeah, how many Americans did you rescue, sir?
Yeah. We've gotten
How
many
many did
Americans
you
out.
personally rescue, sir? None, correct?
Right.
So don't try and talk to me about ground truth. You couldn't even control what was happening in Afghanistan. Let's start there. The next thing I will talk about is under your leadership, we have allowed Iran, the regime, to grow stronger than it's ever in its life. I'll give you some facts here. The Energy Information Agency said that Iran petroleum exports in Iran sold $144 billion in the first 3 years of your administration. Now, why is that number important? Well, because that is $100 billion more than what was permitted in the full 2 years of the Trump administration. You talked about we had to go forward with the Doha agreement. That was part of the, even though it was a conditions-based agreement, you couldn't prevent from pulling out of that. But you had no problem pulling out of Remain in Mexico. That's led to an increase in sex trafficking, fentanyl deaths, and illegal migrants. More angel families than ever. You had no problem, but again, you can't pull out of it, and trying to delist the Houthi rebels from a terrorist organization that now has resulted in 12% of global trade through the Red Sea being disrupted. Do you agree that delisting the Houthis as a terrorist organization was a good play?
In terms of making sure that humanitarian assistance could get to the people of Yemen and that the Houthis were designated under multiple other
So
authorities,
endangering American citizens while now that they're getting increased attacks as a result of your actual failures. And I can tell you with absolute clarity, sir, reclaiming my time, I can tell you with absolute clarity that Hezbollah got stronger while you were in office. Hamas was funded because of your failures to be able to impose necessary sanctions so that the Iranian regime couldn't continue to fund. I'm still talking, Mr. Secretary. You've had your time. You've had 4 years to destroy this nation. You and this administration. I will tell you with absolute certainty, sir, that America is better off with you not in office. That the Iranian regime will now finally start to weaken with stronger sanctions and with us being able to do our jobs for the Iranian people who are actually trying to lead a free democracy. I can tell you that Hezbollah, Hamas's leadership under Sinwar would not have been eliminated if they would have listened to Israel to what Biden had advised, which is ceasefire and stop. Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah would not have been eliminated if they would have listened to your leadership. And I can tell you right now that we are better off as a nation, we are safer as a nation, and our American citizens will be safer with you not sitting in that seat.
Gentleman's
With that, I
time's
yield back.
expired. Mr.
Thank
Costa
you
is
for your judgment. I wish
recognized.
you very good luck.
Mr. Costa is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I, first of all, like others, want to acknowledge the Gold Star mothers and families that are here. My grandmother was a Gold Star mother, and I have a bit of an understanding of the difficult situation that you've been through. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your tenure as the chair here. I've enjoyed serving with you and working with you. Mr. Secretary, you've done a good job, in my opinion, in the 4 years that you've been here under difficult challenges. We can all have different perspectives, but we're in a seminal moment in American and world history, I believe. And I want to talk about that as it relates to our efforts with Ukraine, clear and present. I know you're doing a lot of things, but I think that I want to have some assurance that in the remaining weeks allowed that we do everything possible to move the necessary military equipment, material, and authorizations that Ukraine needs to win this war. With that in mind, there's a transfer currently, and I think you have the information, your staff does, of a dozen Black Hawk helicopters from the United States. They're waiting approval from the State Department to complete this transfer. I'm going to add up a letter, but can you comment on that quickly?
Congressman, I can't speak to a specific transfer. I can just tell you that we are trying to push out the door everything we possibly can to make sure the Ukrainians have everything they need to deal with the ongoing aggression. We continue to do drawdowns, and I signed off on another one as recently as a day ago. I can't speak to the specifics, but I can tell you we're making sure that
Will you get back
every
to us
dollar
as it
that has
relates
been
to these-
authorized and appropriated, we're using.
These 12 Black Hawk helicopters, you have the information,
I'm
your
happy to
office
come back to
does?
you on that.
And please do. How about with other efforts in terms of the money that's been appropriated, that we ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position?
Yes.
It's not clear to me what this next administration is going to do, and I think that it's incumbent upon us to to keep our promises and also to maintain that leadership with our NATO allies.
Yes, we're determined to do everything we can, and it's fully our intent. As I said, every dollar that's been appropriated, we want to see get out the door.
As it relates to Afghanistan, and I was there numerous times, what would you say are the lessons that have been learned? I mean, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback this, I think, and obviously we have people with strong opinions, but you inherited a treaty that had already been signed by the previous administration. You talked in your opening comments about your efforts to try to implement it. It clearly didn't go the way all of us wanted it to. What are the lessons that have been learned? And most important, what changes would you make and why?
I think there are lessons to be learned over the 20 years. There are lessons to be learned over the year preceding the evacuation. There are lessons to be learned from the evacuation itself. As to the latter, and actually the year preceding it, the report that I commissioned, the after-action review that I commissioned, looks at least at what the State Department could and should have done differently and how it could set itself better up for the
Was the
future.
department aware of any Americans in Afghanistan after August 31st who asked for assistance to depart the country, but
Yes.
had not been previously did so?
Yes, we had about, as I said at that time, there were about 200 or so Americans who had identified themselves to us and wanted to leave, but who who couldn't get to the airport or couldn't get into the airport. There were several hundred others who we knew of who did not at that point want to leave because either they couldn't bring extended family with them or they decided that they wanted to stay. After August 31st, the 200 or so who couldn't get to the airport, we were able to get out. Several hundred others came forward, seeing the success of our ongoing efforts to get Americans out, and said, actually, now we want to leave. And between August 31st and December 31st, we got another 495, I believe, American citizens out of Afghanistan because of that enduring commitment to leave no one behind.
Does it make sense that all Americans you may have heard of subsequent to August 31st or 2021 were ever in Afghanistan and then assumed that you had been there, or that the department had known waiting for your help to get them out prior to that date?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I missed the question.
I said, does it make sense to just to add up that all the Americans you may have heard subsequently prior to the August 31st date were ever in Afghanistan and then assume that you knew that they were there and that they were going to have an option?
Again, the challenge we've had, as you know, is that our citizens in any country around the world don't have to tell the government that they're there. They don't have to register with us. When they leave the country, they don't have to deregister. And in Afghanistan, we had many thousands of people who were, in effect, dual nationals who had made their lives in Afghanistan. So
Thank you for your service and
Happy to
thank
go
you
back
for
to
the
the
Gentleman's time
questions.
has expired. I tell members I'm going to keep a very strict 5-minute rule. And Secretary, I know you have a plane to catch to go to the Middle East. Chair recognizes Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for your leadership in this Congress as well as of this committee. Mr. Secretary, you are here with us today to discuss the Biden administration's failure in the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021 and your role in the sad chapter that our country witnessed. During President Biden's time in office and your tenure as Secretary of State, our country has seen many international crises that have become more inflamed. This administration has slow-walked critical arms and capabilities to Ukraine and has prolonged this war into what will be soon its third year. This administration has also intentionally delayed vital assistance to Israel, and that has eroded confidence around the world about American continued support for our strongest ally in the Middle East. We need to, and in addition, you and your president lack of accountability and ownership for the withdrawal from Afghanistan is inexcusable. Mr. Secretary, why did you believe that the Taliban would negotiate with the Afghan government despite President Biden's unconditional surrender on April 14, 2021?
As I said earlier, the Taliban had made commitments under Doha. We wanted to see them fulfill those commitments, including negotiating with the government on a transition. We made every effort diplomatically throughout that period to hold them to that, but it became clear that they wouldn't. And it also became clear that when the deadline expired, the deadline negotiated by the previous administration, they would go back to attacking our forces, attacking our partners, attacking the cities. It would have required us to send tens of thousands of Americans back to Afghanistan. That's not a decision the president is prepared to make.
During that entire time, what leverage did the United States have over the Taliban once President Biden announced that he would abandon our allies, no matter what the Taliban's violations of the Doha Agreement would be?
Again, we had a deadline negotiated by the previous administration, and the choice was not between the status quo and ending the war. The choice was between ending the war and escalating it, because, again, they would have gone back to attacking us. We had only 2,500 forces in Afghanistan. At that point, we would have had to have reinforced them dramatically had the Taliban gone back to directly attacking our forces, directly attacking our partners, going into Afghanistan cities. That was the choice before the president.
Do you agree that your power-sharing agreement further destabilized and delegitimized the Afghan government?
I'm sorry, Congressman, can you repeat that? The power-sharing agreement?
Do you agree that your power-sharing agreement further destabilized and delegitimized the Afghan government?
There wasn't a power-sharing agreement. It was the intent of the Doha Agreement that the Taliban negotiate with the government a ceasefire and a political transition, something that they didn't do. But that was what was in the Doha Agreement. That was the objective.
It was clear that
didn't happen.
That the Taliban was going to violate it, and they did. On May 8th, 2021, your State Department held a rehearsal of concept drill with the Defense Department to plan for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And during that meeting, the military warned against keeping Embassy Kabul open. Your deputy, Brian McKeon, responded, quote, "We at the State Department have a much higher risk tolerance than you guys." Mr. Secretary, it was you who tasked Mr. McKeon with purportedly leading the State Department's neo-planning. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, again, I had trouble hearing that. Please repeat that.
It was during this meeting where you were warned not to keep Embassy Kabul open. Your deputy, Brian McKeon, responded, quote, "We at the State Department have a much higher risk tolerance than you guys." Mr. Secretary, it's you who tasked Mr. McKeon with purportedly leading the State Department's neo-planning. Is that correct? And do you agree with his assessment?
I can't speak to that conversation or to that meeting. What I can speak to is the fact that starting in April, we worked on every scenario with our colleagues from DOD. We did multiple exercises. We planned out what we would need to do, including in the event of a NEO. And as I said before, the decision to actually initiate the NEO is a collective decision made through the interagency process by all of the cabinet-level members and ultimately by the president. The State Department technically initiates it, and it was on August 14th that everyone agreed that we should initiate the NEO. And for reasons that we've discussed before, we didn't want to precipitate a panic. No one believed that the government and military would collapse. We wanted to sustain our diplomatic efforts in Afghanistan.
Respectfully, your decision to keep U.S. Embassy Kabul open against military advice put people's lives at risk, and people were killed. And I want to also express my sympathy.
It was a collective decision.
I want to express my sympathy to the families of the 13 service members who were killed at Abbey Gate, who I know many of the Gold Star families are here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Almo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank you for your leadership as I've started my time in Congress on this committee, and I certainly look forward to working with you in other ways in the future. I certainly also want to recognize the Gold Star families, adding to the comments of my colleagues. We are grateful to you. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here today. And thank you for your extensive cooperation with our committee's oversight of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. Over the past 3 years, your State Department provided thousands of pages of documents and facilitated countless interviews with many career and political officials. I understand this is one of many appearances that you've had on this topic before our committee, and I can relate. Despite only being in Congress for just over a year, this is my third hearing on Afghanistan in this committee. Unfortunately, for my friends on the other side of the aisle, the quantity of these hearings is not really correlated with the quality of them. Their so-called investigation selectively airbrushed the full picture of what happened in Afghanistan. The report ignores any of the actions that Donald Trump took to negotiate the withdrawal. The report claims we abandoned our allies, but fails to mention how Trump folks left behind a backlog of more than 17,000 applications made by our Afghan allies for special immigrant visas. A backlog that forced President Biden's administration to speed up visa processing, bring in temporary help, and work around the clock to protect our allies during the withdrawal. Of all the errors in this flawed report, its worst sin is that it refuses to let facts get in the way of a good story. The report repeatedly claims the State Department waited too long to initiate the U.S. non-combatant evacuation operation. But the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan at the time, Ross Wilson, has testified that initiating this evacuation operation too soon, quote, would have complicated our ability to get out. If we had left earlier, several thousand SIV applicants that we got out would not have been able to leave the country. We would have not been able to provide support to American citizens trying to get out. Our eyes and ears about what was happening around us would have been drastically degraded, unquote. Secretary Blinken, do you agree that Ambassador Wilson's testimony reflects the conditions on the ground at the time and after you initiated the non-combatant evacuation operation? Were there any additional steps that you personally took to ensure that our personnel and allies had the help and resources they needed?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Ambassador Wilson's assessment. And once the evacuation was underway, the NEO was underway, we surged resources to the embassy, including dozens of consular officers, to make sure that we could process anyone getting to and into the airport, American citizens and others eligible to come to the United States. And I have to tell you, Congressman, I have immense pride in the people of my department. I had hundreds raise their hand and volunteer, including dozens who ran into the burning building of HKIA Airport during the evacuation to look out for their fellow citizens, to look out for our Afghan partners, and to do everything possible to bring them out of harm's way.
Yeah. Well, Secretary, I'm grateful for your leadership, and I frankly just wanted to give you an opportunity to correct the record on any claims that we've heard today, and really just communicate some lasting thoughts about this as you depart the State Department.
Look, all I can say is we don't have time to go through everything. I think we've addressed a number of these questions throughout this hearing, and I'm always happy to pursue these conversations. I just hope that somehow we can find ways to work effectively together to shed more light than heat on these very difficult issues. I think that's the spirit in which we should approach things. And for my part, I've been determined to learn the lessons from this experience, not only to learn them, but to act on them. And we've made the State Department stronger and better able to respond to crises than it was when we found it or it was during the Afghan evacuation. And I think that spirit is the one that I would hope would apply to everything we do. I've worked so well with so many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. I hope that that continues even in places where we have deep disagreements. We can question each other's judgments. That's totally appropriate. I hope that we can get out of the business of questioning each other's motives.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Lawler from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, have you read this report in full?
I have read the executive summary of the report. I haven't read the entire report yet. I've read the executive summary.
I hope that you will take this copy with you on your flight to the Middle East and read it, because this is your legacy. This is your legacy. Starting with the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan that resulted in the death of 13 U.S. service members, creating 13 Gold Star families. Families our Vice President hasn't even been bothered to meet with. Then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the terrorist attack on Israel, the illicit oil trade between China and Iran to the tune of $200 billion under your watch. That is what is funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other terror networks in the region. China threatening Taiwan. This is your legacy, and this stems from this disastrous withdrawal. So I hope you read the report in full and reflect upon that. You talk about the Doha Agreement. It's conditions-based. This administration had no problem reversing policy decisions that it disagreed with President Trump on. In fact, Joe Biden revoked 94 executive orders to open up our southern border and create an absolute calamity. 70,000 Americans die every year from fentanyl overdose, as this administration has allowed fentanyl to pour into our country. Drug trafficking, gangs, human trafficking, women and children being sold into prostitution, not a care in the world. This is the legacy. So don't sit here and tell us, having not read the report, that you disagree with it or it's not true, saying to my colleague from Florida, oh, it's not true, we left people in Israel after October 7th. It most certainly is. I had constituents calling in a full-fledged panic, and we called the State Department and we're told there is nothing we can do. Don't tell us that that didn't happen. This administration had no problem trying to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. No problem lifting sanctions on Iran, allowing for the illicit oil trade. So when you say that the previous administration negotiated the Doha Agreement and therefore we were bound by it, that is complete and utter bullshit. And you know it. You absolutely had the ability, based on the conditions on the ground, to keep our troops there, to ensure the safety and well-being of American citizens, and to make sure what happened did not. Mr. Secretary, on August 26, 2021, who was the President of the United States?
Joe Biden.
On August 26, 2021, who was the Secretary of State?
I was.
Okay. Take responsibility. Don't shirk in your responsibilities. Don't try to shift blame. The reality is you guys allowed the conditions on the ground to deteriorate. You did not hold the Taliban to account. And as a result, 13 U.S. service members are dead, and the world is a tinderbox. We are in the most precarious place since the lead up to World War II. That is your legacy. Period. Full stop. And if Israel listened to this administration and didn't go into Gaza and didn't go into the south, Sinwar would still be alive. And if Israel listened to this administration, Nasrallah would still be alive. And Assad would still be in power in Syria. And Iran would be stronger than ever. That is your legacy. This Congress has passed the SHIP Act and the Abraham Accords Special Envoy. You didn't fill the Special Envoy, and you didn't enforce the SHIP Act. You've had over a year to do both. That is your legacy. You leave the world worse off today than it was when you inherited it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Recognize the
Enjoy reading this, because
gentlelady
this
from
is
Pennsylvania,
your
Ms.
legacy.
Wild.
I have a very different legacy, one that I'll be happy to reflect on. I won't have the time to do it today because, of course, you don't provide any time to do it. It's very nice to make a speech, leave me no time to respond.
The chair has
That's the way
recognized
this
Ms.
works.
Wild.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Blinken, let me just say that hearings such as this one probably will aid you in getting over this job very quickly. I do think that you have served commendably. I think also that you have been handed an unprecedented set of world affairs and that you've handled them very well, and I thank you for that. I, too, along with so many of my colleagues, want to express my tribute and my thanks to our Gold Star families and, of course, to our service members who lost their lives in all of Afghanistan's war, not just on the day that we withdrew, but that's really at the heart of what we're discussing today, Americans who wore our country's uniform, those who were injured, those who lost their lives, and of course their families that served alongside them. And I do so wish, I say to all the families, that your loved ones had not been there on that day. I personally feel strongly that we should not have been in that war at that time, and I'm sorry for your losses and that happened. Secretary Blinken, I do want to ask you the same question I asked Ambassador Khalilzad when he testified here a few months ago, because I think it really gets to the underlying reality of why we're here today. Why, over the course of 20 years in Afghanistan, did administrations of both parties fail to correctly assess the level of dedication and cohesion of the Afghan forces and their political leadership?
I think that's a critical question. I hope that the bipartisan commission that is looking into the 20 years of Afghanistan gets at exactly that. And as someone who served in several of those administrations, I also take responsibility for that we did not, I think, see with clarity not only the durability of the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces, but see with clarity how difficult, if not impossible, it would be for us from the outside to somehow build a cohesive country and society. And that is something that, as you said, took place over multiple administrations. And I think that is a critical question that we get a better understanding of. And my hope is that the Commission will look into that.
Well, thank you. I hope so, too. You know, I have grave concerns about the politicization of intelligence that somehow seems to fit a pre-designed agenda over several decades of U.S. military involvement. That is by no means any kind of critique of our troops, ever. It's the people who are making decisions at a much higher level. And I worry that we have a cherry picking of intelligence and data. And I hope that's something that the Commission will also look at, because I think it's vital to make sure that we don't end up in any more forever wars. How do you account, and I know we're running out of time, but can you comment on the intelligence failures specific to Afghanistan?
Look, I think this is collective, which is to say the State Department had knowledge and perspective on this. The Defense Department, having worked with the Afghan military for 20 years, had perspective and knowledge, and of course the intelligence community did. So the judgments that we reached, I would say, were collective judgments. And as I said before, and we've said repeatedly, as we looked at the preponderance of views, no one anticipated the collapse of the government, the collapse of the Afghan forces, when it happened or as quickly as it happened.
Can I just stop you real quickly? Because I wanted to ask you, were you personally surprised by President Ghani's decision to flee?
I was, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, I was on the phone with him late at night on the 14th of August. And he told me we were working on trying to get an agreement to move forward between the Taliban and the government to negotiate some kind of transitional government as a way of averting all of this and moving Afghanistan to a better place. He told me that he was determined to try to do that, but if the Taliban refused, he was going to stay and fight. That was on August 14th. He was gone on August 15th.
Well, thank you. I do hope we as a country learn from this experience. There's obviously a great deal of information to be gathered, and hopefully will be gathered in a nonpartisan or a bipartisan manner so that we can learn in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. You've mentioned probably 5 times today the fact that your intel failure to know what was going to happen. There's an old book you need to read. It's called Groupthink. It examines disasters exactly like this in the past. It probably is worthwhile reading because that's what happened, Groupthink. Now, those of us on this committee who served in Afghanistan and Iraq understand that evil still stalks the world. We saw it. And many of my colleagues on this committee served far deeper into Afghanistan and Iraq than I did. But evil still stalks the world, and I've also heard you say several times here about humanitarian assistance. There is an old military, a political concept that says military use is a failure of diplomacy. It's the last bastion of it. Well, as expected, Mr. Secretary, this has been an interesting back and forth, as I knew it would be. And since I'm fairly low on the totem pole here, we've plowed that ground well. I want to talk about the consequences of this in the world following the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talked about repercussions. There have been many. I'll just mention 2. Following this botched withdrawal and the Taliban takeover, our adversaries have been on the march around the world, encouraged by this error, this strategic error. Words fail to capture the magnitude of the consequences that have been suffered across the globe because of this withdrawal. Yet, according to President Biden himself, the emergency evacuation that cost 13 American service members' lives left behind $7 billion at the low end of military equipment was an extraordinary success. Yet our perceived weakness following Afghanistan, I think it was 2 months later, Putin started moving troops toward Ukraine, also set the scene for the horrific attacks on October 7th. Hamas terrorists and thugs obviously invaded Israel in an unprovoked assault that left Israeli men, women, and children dead, wounded, and hostage, and Americans as well, I might add. That was a critical, unforced error by Hamas. Since that day, Iranian hegemony has faltered. Hamas has lost its leaders and uncontested control over Gaza, while Hezbollah's senior leadership has been eradicated, setting their ambition back for decades. And I will stop here and say that both UNRWA and UNIFIL did not do their job in Gaza and in southern Lebanon, to disastrous consequences. We now find ourselves in the midst of yet another serious issue, which is Syria. The fall of Bashar al-Assad, both Russia and Iran have lost leverage in the Middle East, and while it's good that his reign of terror is over, gassing, torturing, slaughtering thousands, there's still looming questions like, who's keeping the lights on in Syria today, and who's going to control the levers of government tomorrow? Amid the chaos, our steadfast ally, Israel, remains strong. They have significantly weakened Hamas and Hezbollah, directly diminishing Iran's influence in this region. Without Israel's chutzpah and determination, the threats to the United States in the Middle East would be far greater. Israel over the past few days has done the necessary work of destroying the military power of rump Syria. So whoever does emerge to rule Syria cannot threaten Israel. According to the White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, it is an open question who is currently running Syria. Yes, Iran and Russia have failed, but have lost influence in the area, but I am very eager for the leadership of the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. And I want to make sure that's Mike Waltz, the incoming National Security Advisor, not our recently failed Vice President candidate. So, a couple of questions for you. First of all, Mr. Secretary, are you confident that the leader of HTS will be able to keep his word to protect Christians and Islamic women in rump Syria?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not confident. I'm encouraged by the fact that they've said the right thing, but what we have to focus on is whether they do the right thing, including protecting minorities.
The second question is, do you expect Syria to descend into a terrorist enclave?
We certainly need to do everything possible to avoid that. And the coming days, the coming weeks will be critical to that. That's why, and by the way, I very much appreciate you keeping this hearing on time along with Chairman McCall. I need to leave to get on a plane to go to the region to see King Abdullah of Jordan. And I appreciate that there's some other members here who've not yet had a chance to ask questions. I'm happy to take those questions for the record and get back to you quickly.
Mr. Secretary, I yield back to the chairman, and he will recess this.
Thank you, sir. Chair recognizes Mr. Moshowitz.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll be quick, Mr. Secretary. First, let me thank the chairman, Chairman McCall, for his bipartisan work on this committee. This has been one of those bright spots of this Congress. I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your sacrifice and your service to the country. These jobs are unforgiving and have deep impacts on everybody's individual families. And so I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank the Gold Star families for being here. And like I have before, apologize to them for what happened to their loved ones in Afghanistan. I'm not going to go into all the stuff that's been said by 30 people, but I do want to say this, Mr. Chairman. You know, the official Twitter account of this committee put out a tweet at 11:27, and it says, at this committee's final hearing this Congress, we brought in Secretary Blinken to testify on the disastrous Biden-Harris withdrawal from Afghanistan after months of stonewalling. Sadly, many of the Democratic seats are empty at this important hearing. I don't know what intern put this out, but it is misinformation, and it is literally a lie. First of all, if you look at the picture, half the seats on that side of the aisle are empty, and I'm not blaming them. That's how these committees work. We all know this. People come in and out of these hearing rooms. But let me give you the numbers. 20 of the 23 Democrats on this committee were here today. 23 of the 28 Republicans were here today. Of the ones that were here, 17 Democrats asked questions, 17 Republicans asked questions. So the official account of this committee is making it appear that we don't care about what happened in Afghanistan. It is not true. And that tweet should come down. Because while our enemies are trying to divide us abroad in social media, we're just giving them a gift by saying, hey, half the party, half the country doesn't care. There were major mistakes made in Afghanistan. I've said that in previous hearings. So I appreciate everyone going on their soapbox about morality and truth and facts and trying to hold the secretary to that high standard. But then we got to do it ourselves in this committee. Mr. Secretary, a lot of things were said. I know you have to leave. I just wanted to give you the balance of my time to close about your legacy.
Thank you. Look, I have to leave it to others to make those judgments. But from my perspective, we have worked from day one to re-engage, re-energize, and even reimagine our alliances and partnerships around the world. We've done just that. And as a result, we are in a much stronger position than we were to deal with a multiplicity of challenges, more complicated than at any time in the 32 years that I've been engaged in this work. We demonstrated that with the work of bringing more than 50 countries together in support of Ukraine as it dealt with the Russian aggression. We've demonstrated that in building extraordinary convergence that we've never seen before in terms of purpose and action when it comes to dealing with the challenges posed by China among European allies and partners and among partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We've seen that in bringing countries together to tackle everything from COVID to fentanyl to food security. Across the board, that's a result of our engagement, of our diplomacy, of bringing countries together in common purpose and in ways that advance the national interest. That's how I've seen it. Others are free to make their own judgments about it. But I think in doing that, one of the sources of our strength and success is the ability to work closely with Congress. We're stronger at home because we've made remarkable investments in things like infrastructure, the CHIPS and Science Act, the IRA. That goes directly to our strength abroad. Other countries see that. They see that we've reinvested in our own competitiveness. They want to work with us. They want to engage with us. They want to partner with us. And because we've been so attentive to our alliances and partnerships, we now have countries that before were looking to do things on their own without us that are now united with us in common purpose. That doesn't just happen. It happens because we have extraordinary men and women at the State Department, among other places, who are out there every single day building those alliances, building those partnerships, and then using them when we need to deal with challenges like Russia and Ukraine, like China, like so many of the other challenges we face around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield the balance of my time back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. I know that your main responsibility as a secretary is to execute the president's foreign policy. As an Afghan veteran and as a guy who's got tons of friends that served over there even longer than I did, years away from their family, the guys who lost their limbs, the families who sacrificed, the people who lost their lives, my hat's always off for those families who are gold stars, and even the families who just served and made that sacrifice away from their families. I really have great respect. I know we were there for about 20 years in Afghanistan, so you can't take responsibility for 20 years, but you can take responsibility for those 4 years. I know that we spent about $2 trillion of that dollars. A lot of that wasn't on your watch. That's also a lesson learned that we had to live with. I know 2,462 lives roughly passed because of that war that we sacrificed as Americans, but most of those not on your watch. What I do want to hold you and our leadership accountable for is the stuff we left behind, very specifically. Yesterday, I had the ambassador of Pakistan in my office, and we were talking about terrorism in his nation and how we create stability in that region. I'm a foreign affairs guy that's my region. And they've had over 600 terrorist attacks in their nation last year, and I was like, why? Why so many? He said, because a lot of the weapons that we left behind in Afghanistan are now being used for attacks in Pakistan and other areas around there, and it's munitions we left behind. I personally thought it was a horrible withdrawal. I've talked to Millie. I've already had a breakdown. He went down and step by step went through the process of the withdrawal. But quite frankly, it wasn't just the $4 billion of our troop supplies that we left behind, but the $90 billion that we had given to the Afghanis that was then used now to sustain their country and the evil empire that's basically spreading terrorism throughout the region. I don't really accept the premise that they're not harboring bad guys. I know we have terrorist cells there. I know that they're training. We've been briefed on that. We don't need to get into the specifics, but I quite frankly think in a real sort of way, the equivalent of equipment that we left over there, which is probably similar to what we just gave to Ukraine in aid. And to fight a first world army, the Russians, is now being used to spread terrorism throughout the world, and that's on us. The United States is literally sponsoring terrorism around the world using the weapons that we gave to them we didn't hold accountable for. And one thing we learned in the military, whether it was 16 years in the Marine Corps, 4 years in the Navy, or training with the Army, accountability is our first step. We take responsibility for what we do. How would you answer to that?
So two things, Congressman. I very much appreciate the question. First, the weapons you're referring to built up over 20 years. The hard reality is that in order to avoid extending the war, escalating the war, sending tens of thousands of Americans back into Afghanistan, would have been impossible to take out all of those weapons, all of that equipment. Much of it was dismantled or otherwise made inoperative. Much of it that remained is almost certainly inoperative because it had to be maintained, and they don't have the capacity to maintain it. But I grant you, there are no doubt some number of weapons or equipment that, yes, are being used by the regime. But the Taliban government itself is not in the business, for all of the horrific things that it's doing inside Afghanistan to its people, is not in the business of exporting terrorism in this moment. And that, at least, is a good thing. And so I don't see this equipment, such as it is, being used for that purpose. It is very regrettable that equipment was left behind, but I think it's a reality of 20 years, trillions of dollars of equipment to the Afghans.
So I would disagree with one premise, and this is where I think the crux of this is used, because I want to learn from this. We should never set a date or a time to be political about anything we do. This is about the survival of our troops, what's best for our investment, return on investment. And I think we got locked into a date. If I could learn anything from this, we got locked into a date, let us make some really bad decisions planning-wise that left a lot of equipment behind. And quite frankly, when I was there, we had fewer people there than we have Spain. We never fought a war in Spain. And we're so in a hurry to say, I want this feather in my cap that I got out of Afghanistan, that we forgot to do it right. When you forget to do it right, shame on us. And I think we should never be locked into a date or a time or a situation where we're not in control, because we are the biggest, baddest country on the planet. And shame on us for not doing it right, because I think that costs us a lot of reputation. With that, I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. We're going to try to keep this brief. I know the Secretary has to go to the Middle East to meet with the King of Jordan. Mr. Moran from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here today. I want to start where Mr. Moskowitz left off just a second ago. Speaking about the withdrawal, he said, and I quote, "There were major mistakes made in Afghanistan." First of all, do you agree with that statement by Mr. Moskowitz?
I do.
Could you specify the mistakes that you believe were made in the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I think the most fundamental mistake was, again, not recognizing that the fragility of the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, and not anticipating across the government, and I take responsibility for this along with the other departments of government, in recognizing that there was a potential, more than the potential, likelihood of very quick collapse by both the government and the security forces.
How would you advise a president in the future under similar circumstances to do something different? What different advice would you give to him or her?
I think we have to do what we did, but obviously we didn't see this piece of it, which is to continuously question the assumptions, to continuously prod and push on any assumptions, including about the durability of a government or the military forces.
Do you think it was a mistake to withdraw, even though the conditions preceding in the Doha Agreement had not been met by the factions in Afghanistan?
I do not. I believe it was the right thing to do to end America's longest war. I believe that our country is actually better for it, stronger for it. I believe our adversaries have seen that we were not going to get bogged down into another decade of war in Afghanistan, and that has been a good thing. And again, I just remind you that the basic choice, to the extent there was a choice, was between ending the war and leaving or escalating it, because part of the Doha Agreement was a commitment by the Taliban not to attack our forces between the time the agreement was signed and the withdrawal date that was set in the Doha Agreement was reached. Once that was breached, they would go back to attacking us. They would, our partners, our military determined we would have to send tens of thousands of forces back to Afghanistan.
I think I heard you say earlier that you didn't think there was a connection between the botched withdrawal and the aggression, the increased aggression by Russia as against Ukraine earlier. Did I hear you correctly say that?
That's correct.
When the withdrawal occurred, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder, warned a few days after President Biden's unconditional surrender to the Taliban that, quote, "Moscow and Beijing will look closely at how we react in one situation to set the stage for the other." So did you disagree with that then, or do you disagree with that now?
So what we saw, first of all, is that, of course, Russia had massed all of these forces well before the withdrawal or the decision, actually, to go forward with it. We saw that take place in the spring. Second, Russia has a long experience with Afghanistan. It probably knows better than anyone the folly of getting bogged down in that country. And what we've seen since is the United States marshaling more than 50 countries, coming to the defense of Ukraine and doing tremendous damage to Russia's efforts in Ukraine.
Let's look at what the Chinese said about this. On the second anniversary of the withdrawal, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, quote, "On this date 2 years ago, the whole world witnessed the, quote, Kabul moment when the U.S. hastily withdrew its troops from Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan marked a military, political, and counterterrorism failure of the U.S. in Afghanistan." That's a quote by a Chinese government official. Do you think that our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way that we handled it precipitated additional aggression by China towards Taiwan?
I don't. In fact, we've seen this build up for more than a decade. And again, as I said earlier, in 2008, we had 200,000 troops between Afghanistan and Iraq. That's when the Russians invaded Georgia. In 2014, we still had 12,000 troops in Afghanistan. That's when the Russians first invaded Ukraine. These decisions are made for their own reasons, and with Russia and Ukraine, or with China and Taiwan. This long predated any things we decided or did in
I want to ask
Afghanistan.
real quickly, as my time expires, about before and after our withdrawal. So if we're looking before and after the withdrawal, do you think that the situation in Afghanistan is better inside Afghanistan today or before withdrawal as it relates to, number one, the safety and security of women and young girls?
I think the situation is worse for women and young girls. There's no question about that.
What about the access and opportunities for education for women and young girls today or before withdrawal?
Worse. No question
And
about that.
the opportunities to enter the workforce for women today or before withdrawal?
Worse.
Do you think a leave-behind force, even a small force, may have created stability in the region, or would that not have been
That was
something
not
you
the
would agree?
choice. The choice was not leaving 2,500 people there. The choice was whether we were going to send tens of thousands of Americans back indefinitely with no guarantee of better results. It's also important to remember that by December 2020, the Taliban either controlled or contested territory that had 75% of the population of Afghanistan. Life for them then, including women and girls, was not good. But I agree with you, it's gotten worse.
Do you agree we need to take additional steps to protect the lives of women and young girls in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I agree we need to maximize every effort to do that.
Gentleman's
We
time
hope I'm working with
expired.
you on that.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moylan.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but as we said before this hearing, I had a hard stop at 2 o'clock.
I
have to
agree.
get on a
If we
plane
could
to
keep
Syria.
this limited, we have Mr. Moylan, Mr. Van
I'm happy to
Orden.
take, I
and,
very much respect the members and their questions. I'm happy to take the questions and respond within the next week.
Why don't we ask both of you, I want to give you the opportunity to ask one question.
One question. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Miller was our last commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, Mr. Secretary, and he came before this committee. And the important thing that General Miller wanted to relay to us was about the characterization of your State Department's attitude toward the military, Mr. Secretary. General Miller was saying to this committee that there was this assumption, the State Department's assumption, that we don't need the military. It was the State Department's assumption, according to General Miller, that why don't you know this, General? You're withdrawing. Why don't you get out of here? All of you, just go away. That's General Miller, our last commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, what he felt important to share with this committee. Now, Mr. Secretary, in institutions like the State Department, your State Department, such attitudes often come from the top. I'm an Army officer myself, and it's all up to the leadership. So is it your assumption, sir? Did you assume to your State Department that your embassy in Afghanistan did not need the military?
Absolutely not. And on the contrary, Congressman, first of all, I have tremendous respect for General Miller, everything he's done, everything he's put at risk himself. Second, I've had the incredible honor of serving this country in various capacities, State Department, White House, National Security Council, for the better part of 30 years now. And throughout those 30 years, one of the things I take the most pride and pleasure in is the work that I've been able to do with our military.
I understand that,
and
Mr.
so,
Secretary.
My department, in my time, certainly in terms of my own instructions to them, has done nothing short of do everything possible to strengthen and continue this essential collaboration. We can't do our jobs
Mr.
without the United
Secretary,
States military.
I'll take back my time. In this case, Mr. Secretary, I understand what you're saying here and now, but the generals, Miller, our last commander of U.S. forces, this is what he had to say to us. And sir, you may be saying this now, but however, the example that your employees understood is different than from what you're telling me. It's as if there was an absence of leadership that put the State Department of Employees in America and America at risk. I'm sorry to say, sir, that this type of attitude that your State Department has had regarding...
I would ask the gentleman to please expedite the question.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Basically, sir, it didn't work out, according to General Miller, our last commander of U.S. forces. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me on your committee, and thank you for your leadership throughout the years. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming here. I'm just going to establish some bona fides. I'm going to ask you a couple quick series of questions, and then I'm going to actually give you the chance, sir, to make sure that you could leave with your last hearing by doing something good for your legacy. I have served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, including one where I held one of my friend's hands as he was dying, listening to his wife crying through a satellite phone into his ear because she knew she would never see her husband again. And the Gold Star families here have my greatest sympathy. And we owe you a debt that does not go away. It's not a mortgage. It's not a 30-year commitment. It's forever. I'm the longest.
Discover your new Hyundai right now at Fitzgerald Hyundai Rockville. Like the 2025 Hyundai Sonata, lease.
Citizens and green card holders left in Afghanistan. The answer to that is correct. How many? You can't tell me.
And you know
hey,
why
listen, man, I forgot to mention that, like my colleague, Corey, I was one of the guys that went to go rescue American citizens. So I know you couldn't tell me. We knew, and you either didn't know or you lied. And here is my question. You are the Secretary of State now. Can you, with Secretary Mayorkas, grant a green card to someone who can absolutely 100% be verified for saving hundreds, and hundreds of American service members and risking his life for over a decade, who is currently here under humanitarian parole. Can you guys do that?
I would be happy to work with you on that.
His name is Azizullah Aziz.
Happy to pursue that with you, Congressman.
Thank you very much, sir. And I'll tell you right now, you get this done, it is going to go, it's going to be one of the best things you could possibly do to redeem your reputation and your legacy as Secretary of State. And with that, I yield back.
Joan yields. Let me just say thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to thank you for your service as well. I think you'll be pleased to know this will be the last time you will appear before this committee as Secretary of State and me as Chairman. And there's been a lot of talk about legacy. I know we've been working on legislation together called the Overseas Crises Response Implementation System and Immediate Strategy Act, or Overseas Crises. I hope that could be part of your legacy and mine as we close the chapter on Afghanistan, sir. And I wish you Godspeed to the Middle East. And again, thank you for your service. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit questions. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Today, Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger will testify about recent bomb threats and fake reports made to emergency services targeting lawmakers and other government officials. You can watch this Senate Rules Committee hearing live starting at 2:45 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, or online at cspan.org. Since 1979, in partnership with the cable industry, C-SPAN has provided complete coverage of the halls of Congress, from the House and Senate floors to congressional hearings, party briefings, and committee meetings. C-SPAN gives you a front row seat to how issues are debated and decided, with no commentary, no interruptions, and completely unfiltered. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
Are you a nonfiction book lover looking for a new podcast? This holiday season, try listening to